already know the rules. Sleep with your feet towards the door. I'm always grateful to read posts from others explaining the rules of particular places. A library where you mustn't interrupt the girl in the reflective jacket who reads collected ESVM poems to herself until midnight. A campsite where you must politely offer some of your food to the faceless people who visit your campfire. An old house where you mustn't look out of the window if you hear the sound of bells. Particular places have particular rules. It might be because they're ancient, special, haunted, cursed, or just particularly beautiful places for other things to make their homes. Sometimes you can learn a little from reading others' lists, others' hard-won knowledge of what is or isn't safe, but spirits are petty and varied. One will tear out your tongue if you speak to it, another will kill you for rudeness if you don't. It takes an expert on the area to know. Cities often don't have guardians in quite the same way that rural places have. Forests, lakes, valleys, even big ranches, they'll have owners or rangers or guardians, often passed down through generations or trained and picked carefully by mentors. I like talking to people from those wild places. The guardians, rangers, and owners of forests and lakes and valleys. I respect the hell out of their attitude, their reverence for the places they watch over. I don't have anything that special. I stumbled into this. I'll tell you that story if you're patient. And while I'd rather die than be impolite to something really ancient and fey, sometimes in cities what you're actually dealing with is a vomit nymph or a minor cocaine spirit, and that's occasionally hard to take seriously. But I'm lucky. I tend not to need specific rules. Of course, there's places like the bridge you mustn't walk under if your voice doesn't echo, and Arthur's Seat has its fair share of terrifying things. But for the most part, I'm only really concerned by the universal rules, the ones that pretty much apply anywhere, whether it be an ancient haunted cathedral or the most mundane cafe. If you're hurrying home between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., don't look behind you. Make sure your bed has your head further from the door than your feet, and ensure at least one side, preferably two, is against a wall. If you're walking past a room and see a person out of the corner of your eye, but when you check again, it's just an outfit on a coat hanger, don't freak out. But always make sure you check again. Break at least one solemn promise before about mid-February of each year. Close your closet door firmly before sleeping. It's okay if it cracks open so long as it's too narrow for a finger. Stay under your blanket when you sleep. Having a leg out of the blanket is okay, but don't position your feet where they could be seen from under your bed. Windows can slide upwards or open outwards, but must never ever open inwards. If you feel the intense sensation that something is watching you from the window, ideally close the curtains. You can look from your bed or couch, but never go over to the window and look down, and never ever press your face against the glass. Only certain people are safe to sleep in complete darkness. You'll know instinctively if you're one of the ones who needs to keep a light on or a window open. Don't sleep with someone until you've had at least 3 dates. They can't maintain a good consistent mimic for more than 2 evenings, so after 3, you're safe. On midwinter morning, whichever date you personally celebrate as your winter festival, ensure there's at least one sock in your home that has no pair. There's more, but I don't need to tell you them. See, the universal rules have become part of us now. Either they're in our biology, things we've known from birth without needing to be taught them, or they're aspects of culture that get most people to obey them without knowing why they're doing it. Some of them, I think, aren't actually universal. For instance, I think the rule that you must offer tea, specifically tea to strangers in your home, is only on this island. The creatures that demand it only really live here. I think some of the rules are culturally dependent, because of course an arbitrary calendar day isn't actually how most non-humans count New Year. It's about the rhythms of your life, and the points in those rhythms where certain things might pay attention to you. Edinburgh doesn't really have many rules that you wouldn't get elsewhere, not rules that apply to all of it. You get some hecking specific rules if you're working in certain parts of the castle at 3 a.m., but really it's just a matter of common sense. It's a very old city, an important city. Scotland is an old, wild country, and it remembers all sorts of things. It's a beautiful city with so many layers to it, and so many ghosts. There are things here you wouldn't imagine. But you don't have to tap on anything 7 times. And if you order a kebab from the man with a tattoo of a swarm of wasps after taking the last train from Glasgow, look, you didn't know how bad a decision that was, but you damn well knew it was a bad idea. At this point, you're probably wondering who the hell I am. I certainly don't have any official position. I don't own any land here. I'm not descended from anyone, and I'm not trained as police or anything. Actually, no human picked me. It seemed random. The night after I moved here, almost 16 years ago, I had the most fantastically vivid dream. I was dancing with the most beautiful woman I've ever seen. She had flame red hair and wore a tattered copper dress. She danced with a sword in each hand, but I was unafraid. She moved with such clarity of intent, and she inspired me so much with her grace that I was able to fluidly move around her in perfect timing, and the blades never touched me. I'd never danced in my life, and I can't dance when I'm awake, but she moved me. That's all I can explain. I was woken up by a knocking on my door. It was the same woman. I admit, after our dance, I'm feeling a little famished, she said. I invited her in for eggs and bacon. In hindsight, that was stupid. Most magic runs on rules and rituals, and the laws of thresholds, home sanctity, and hospitality are some of the oldest of all. There's plenty of things out there which only need an invite into your home to destroy you, but I'm glad I did. She didn't touch the eggs and bacon, but she told me it was a kind and respectful offer. The first thing she told me was about Waverley. Well, no, actually, the first thing she told me was that I needed to get a new coffee machine because my old one was going to break in about 5 more coffees. The second thing she told me was that before getting on a train to Stirling, I should check if there's a stop at Silvery. There is no Silvery on the line to Stirling. At least, not unless I'm at the station. I've checked with friends who've confirmed this. It's only there when I am, as far as I know. It's safe for me to get off at Silvery. I have an invitation. It is not safe for you, and you shouldn't try. I saw a teenager try it once, and another man who was probably just counting stops to his normal one and didn't look up from his phone as he got off. That's another one of those stories you can ask me for. Anyway, my day job is in an office, and I do things with spreadsheets. It's just, no, in my spare time, I'm one of the people who helps with the rules. There's actually a fair few of us, with as many people and other beings as there are in a big city, but I don't know the others. And I'm writing all of this because apparently some people don't know all the rules. They just didn't get it somehow. Their parents didn't teach them, or their instincts are all wrong. So I figured I should write something that explains them. Some of them are obvious. You fucking know why your closet door must never be wide enough, cracked open for a long gray finger to curl out from inside and wrap itself slowly around the door. If you don't, please just imagine your reaction were you to see that. Congrats. Now you know. Some of them you think you learned better about. You didn't. Adults know it's safe to put your feet on the cracks between the paving stones, but that doesn't mean children are wrong about it being dangerous. The edgelings only take small, tender victims, but some are counterintuitive. George, a local nurse and one of the other part-time guardians, called me up yesterday. That was the call that prompted this post. He told me about an awfully weird occurrence at the hospital. Apparently, an elderly patient reported waking up at around 3 a.m., drenched in sweat, hearing nothing but perfect silence. She looked at the door, and in walked a sort of, I hesitate to call it a man. Apparently, it had arms that were far too long and dragged on the floor, only a gaping bloody hole where its eyes should be, and a torso that wrapped around in spirals like a knotted rope. The man stopped in the doorway, breathing heavily, and then reached out with one hand. It seemed like his feet couldn't pass the doorway, apparently, but his hands could. Walking his fingers across the floor, then eventually taking a deep breath and supporting the full weight of that awfully long arm, he groped along the beds of the ward until he reached hers. When he touched her feet, his hands weren't cold. They were warm, slimy, a little suctiony. Something told her to remain perfectly still, not to react, not to give any sign of life. The moist, heavy fingers explored her toes a little, lifted her heel, and then dropped her foot. The long-armed creature sighed heavily. "No tasty eyes here," it whined. "Need tasty eyes." It took a deep breath, coughed up some slime, and whimpered like a child begging for ice cream. "Delicious eyes." And then it left. Apparently the doctors think the woman's crazy. There's absolutely no sign of the creature on the hospital CCTV, no slime where it supposedly coughed. But George is the nurse that helps old people get cleaned up, and he says her feet were sticky in a way that turned his stomach, and George's stomach is strong enough to clean pus out of the guy who decided to stick his dick up the open surgical wounds in his own arm and then laugh about it over a pint. George mentioned he's damn glad his patient was sleeping with her head and her eyes away from the door and her feet towards it. He's made sure it's hospital policy to ask all patients to sleep that way. I thought it might be valuable to let you all know. I'll be back with more stories of the work people like George and I do. Longer ones, haha, since I won't have to give all this context, and perhaps some more explanations of the rules you already know. You already know the rules. If you feel like something is behind you, don't look over your shoulder. When I wrote yesterday about never sleeping with your head towards a door, I admit I was honestly a little overwhelmed by all the comments and positive responses. I'm glad I've helped so many people stay informed and stay safe, though I hope I haven't scared you off Edinburgh. It's a beautiful city. A lot of you mentioned the rules about spaces behind you. Don't look in mirrors in dark rooms. Don't look over your shoulders at what might be following you. Don't rush or act afraid when you sense something behind you, and so on. So I thought I'd write something about those rules to help explain and to help deter the few of you who think you'll go around glaring defiantly behind you as if you can prove me wrong. You know you can't do that. You know how strong that instinct is, that you shouldn't look, and you know that nobody told you. You got it from somewhere deep within you. It's convenient because this is also the story of how I met George. I'm just going to be honest with you, out late at night, mildly tipsy, buying a deep-fried Mars bar. For those who don't live in regions where this exquisite cuisine is possible, you're just going to have to believe me that it's good. It just is. Moving on, I left with my battered prize and was about to sink my teeth in when I saw him. A young man, dark-haired, coat turned up against the cold. I approved of the coat and his sensible woven scarf. I saw him throw a look over his shoulder as he passed. I didn't approve of that so much. And then I saw his shadow become ever so very slightly larger. Fuck. I knew about the thing behind you even back then. I wouldn't have been allowed to do this job without at least some preparation. But I'd never seen it hunt in real time before. Never been the bystander as it got started. If I called to the young man, would that make him look again? If I followed him, that definitely wouldn't help. Fuck. I didn't know him, but I couldn't just let this happen. I made a snap decision and broke into a sprint. I'd circle round the hill and meet him on the other end of the street. It had been raining, and my feet slipped a little over the cobblestones, the cold air rushing into my ears for an instant headache. I needed to be in front of this guy. I saw him again as he hurried round a corner and threw another anxious glance behind him. "You've got to stop doing that," I called out. Dude looked at me like I was crazy, glanced at me, glanced behind him, and then back at me. "Are you talking to me?" A pipe was dripping water into the gutter at the corner of the square. Each droplet stood out to me in the darkness, tiny pearls gilded by reflected lamplight. I don't know what George was hearing, but I could tell the rhythm of that drip wasn't entirely natural. Drip, 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 drip. Pause. Drip, 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 drip. "Yes, and I need you to stop looking behind you." After a moment's thought, I added, "Because there's nothing behind you." The shadow shrank just a little bit. I hadn't practiced this. I'd never done this before. And my facial expression must have given it away, and the young man noticed. His shadow grew, and this time it wasn't a subtle difference. It wasn't one of those imperceptible differences that you only pick up on if you're me. It looked like someone was shining a torch right under his feet to cast a shadow that big. The shadow loomed up on the crescent behind George, broken up by the shapes of Edinburgh's typical tall windows and cut off just at the neck by the dark tiles of the roofs. "You're looking behind me," he accused, but he didn't turn around. That was good. I approved of that. Sensible Scarf Boy might have forgotten the rules, but at least he could see it once I reminded him. I made a series of rapid plans in my head, all discarded. It was imperative that he calm down. It was absolutely imperative that he didn't look behind him. I needed him not to see that shadow at all costs. I would have been more than happy to blind him, but I wasn't entirely sure how to achieve that from a distance with the 2 pens, keys, and a phone in my pockets. And I sure as hell wasn't chancing a wrestling match. Trying somehow to look as though I was both non-threatening and a total professional, I skipped the last few steps to the dark-haired man, grabbed his arm, and started down the street. I was almost surprised when he complied, but then I looked over at him. Now I was closer, I could see the tears in his eyes. "You know what's behind me," the man accused in a whisper. "I do," I admitted, "and it feeds on fear, so I need you to stop thinking about that. I want you to think about the fact I'm taking you to a safe place. I want you to think about deep-fried Mars bars." I realized as I said it that I still had the damn thing in my hands and offered him a bite. He accepted, trembling. "I'd like you to focus on telling me your name and what you'd like to make for breakfast tomorrow." We were walking briskly, and I had a grip on his forearm that was a little too hard. I shifted it to his shoulder. The thing behind him was substantial enough now that it was casting its own shadow. I prayed he didn't notice. I couldn't make out much from the shadow, but it looked like it had a pretty long knife. "George?" was all he offered in response. I suppose that is fair, given how terrified he was. "Okay, George, we're going to... Fuck it. My place is too far. We're just going to pop into the library. That's a couple streets over." There were 3 sets of footsteps on the cobblestones. I hurried mine along, wanting to make sure George didn't notice. Kept up a patter of completely meaningless talk. The thing behind George's knife got longer. The relief when I saw the light spilling from the front door of my local library absolutely drenched me. I kept a steady, brisk pace up to the front door, shoved George inside, and shut the door behind us. It was only a glass door. It wouldn't hold. I drew George further into the library, found a chair I could position in the corner, and made sure he had his back to 2 walls before we relaxed. Both of us were breathing hard in the sudden quiet. "That was one of the other you just handled for me, wasn't it?" I froze. George wasn't supposed to be asking about that. Why would he know about that? "It's okay," he reassured me. "I'm a guardian too. Just, I kind of inherited it, and I don't know what I'm doing yet. So I told him the rules. Not to ever look behind him if he's on a dark street like that. If it's targeted you once, you're more vulnerable. I told him how it progresses. At first, it's your shadow. If you don't believe in it, it's not strong enough to do much or to hurt you. But when you glance behind you, and perhaps you see a leaf stirring in the wind or an oddly shaped shadow, it lends just a little credibility to the idea that maybe there could be, or could have been, something there. That little bit of belief is enough to give it power. Still not enough power to hurt you. Still not enough to take physical form even, but enough perhaps to change the way a water pipe drips or nudge the air to blow a little differently. You think you hear something behind you, so you look over your shoulder again. That little bit of extra belief still won't give it physical form, but it can nudge things. It could make the air feel warmer on your neck. It could make the street seem quiet, too quiet. It could lengthen your shadow so that if you turn around and glance at it, something might seem off. You believe something is off, something is dangerous. Perhaps you believe, a little bit, that there might be something behind you. It gets stronger. I told him all this before realizing I had made a terrible mistake. Have you ever read, or told, a story that scared you so hard, your eyes watered from the sheer mental strain of it all? Like your fear was leaking in liquid form from the nearest outlet? I'd made sure George had his back to a wall. I hadn't done the same for myself, and my tears were blurring my vision. I wiped them away and noticed George was a little more scared than I'd expect from simply hearing about a monster, at least from a guardian. "Is there something behind me?" I asked in the most measured, calm voice I could possibly summon. "Absolutely not." A book fell on my head. "There is definitely nothing behind you." I could feel the breath on my neck just as I'd mentioned it. I wished I hadn't used that example. I hate breath on my neck. "Please, look at me." I think in hindsight, George's nurse training kicked in. I looked at him, tried to actually stop scanning the empty library aisle for anything to help, and looked at him, right into his eyes. He has chocolate brown eyes. "There is absolutely nothing behind you. There never has been. You are safe. You are completely safe." I stood up. There's one last thing you can try in an emergency. It works best if you trust someone with your life, but George was all I had. I walked towards him, took his hands and pulled him up. I almost slipped his hands out of mine, they were so sweaty. "Would you prove there's nothing behind me for me?" I asked, knowing how shitty it was for me to ask. "Could we stand back to back?" The ordinary nurse, who never wanted any of this, looked over my shoulder. He visibly flinched. I felt the sensation of someone behind me slipping a knife around, poised in front of my throat. George closed his eyes and rapidly took 2 steps past me, directly into whatever was behind me. But there was no sound. I felt his back pressed against mine, trembling. There was no knife against my throat. I reached behind me and held his hands, and we stood like that for a while, breathing in tune, hearts thudding like rabbits, knowing the only things behind us were small or harmless enough for the other to face them for a stranger. Anyway, that's how I met George. Of course, I couldn't stop it. The thing behind me got its prey that night, though it wasn't either of us. I saw her that Sunday afternoon, a woman hurrying past on a half-empty street who looked like she'd been thrown out with the trash and not combed her hair since. She was stumbling a little, wearing office clothes, looking like she was late for getting fired. Sleep deprivation was absolutely etched into her face, far too wrinkled for the age she looked like she should be. She didn't even look up or notice us as she stumbled past. She'd probably learned by then. Looking the way the tiredness had made her, people who heard her pleas for help would assume she was crazy, a homeless beggar or a drug addict. I knew better, but I also knew better than to try to save her at this point. Right as she almost disappeared from view, she threw a glance over her shoulder. And just as she did, another woman rounded the corner, coming the same way she'd come, so they barely glimpsed each other before the first woman disappeared from view. Younger looking, prettier since she wasn't a wreck, better dressed. You'd never notice she looked exactly like the first woman. She walked with the most perfectly measured, patient step. When I blinked again, she was gone. I check obituaries, always, and coroner's notes and crime reports. Officially, this woman died of some kind of mental illness or drug overdose. She went crazy, that's for certain. That's good. You're supposed to go crazy when you're sufficiently sleep-deprived. It's one of the oldest defenses we have. It prevents you being completely sure that the thing behind you is what kills you. So, don't glance behind you when you're hurrying home late at night. You already know this rule. You know it for a reason. I'm doing my best to keep you safe. It was risky to write this and risky to make you believe a little more, so you better have followed all the instructions. Sleep with one side of your bed against the wall. Tell your friends that they shouldn't be glancing over their shoulders because it'll only make them more scared. And if you get up to use the bathroom and you're still feeling anxious from reading this, don't look in the mirror. You already know the rules. Don't step on the cracks. None of you asked to know about this rule. Everyone's all interested in what's under your bed and what's in your mirrors and why you need to run up the basement stairs. Well, sorry. First, there's one that I've realized I just need to get off my chest. So if there's any kids reading, don't step on the cracks. Writing this has been overwhelming. So many people asking for help with specific situations, which, sorry, I can't give. You'd have to speak to me in person. How exactly to communicate with guardians varies. There isn't really a system, just a patchwork. If there's nobody who knows how to keep the peace between humans and the others in a particular area, either humans will stop living there or someone will end up doing the job, whether they inherit it, learn it, are appointed, or are cursed with it. So if you need help, the methods vary. Some of us are, not gonna lie to you, kind of shit. Those folks just sorta wander the streets waiting for the supernatural to bump into them so they can sternly tell it off. There's others who have artifacts or helpers to detect signs of folks in need. No, we do not all have a group chat. I've just met a few of us over the years. I'm afraid I'm not the people-oriented type. I know where the bad guys are, but I just try to handle them in priority order, depending on how risky they are. I don't actually know if they're currently endangering anyone specific, unless I literally see something crash through your window. Even what I've got, I'm lucky to have. I'm only human, but I'm also a dancer, and my dancing partner is quite special. I know when people have broken rules, important rules, because the dark things will tell me. Last night, for instance, they whispered a name to me. Someone who'd looked out her window at precisely the wrong time and seen something she shouldn't, something that didn't like to be seen. They told me her life was forfeit, and I agreed that I wouldn't try to save her, because letting them take the ones who offend them is why they leave the rest of us alone. I maybe could have found out where she lived, gone over, somehow persuaded her to salt every window and threshold, and gotten her to wear silver on both wrists and any fingers she wanted to keep. But I have limits. I'm always so busy over the holiday period, so I let her go. By now, I'm used to letting people go. But the story I want to tell you all is an old story from when I was new to all this. I was fanatical at first, see? I thought this guardian thing made me invincible. So when the wanted posters went up for a little girl named Bryony, the daughter of a friend who'd helped me move, I didn't care if she was kidnapped by a human or personally picked out for slaughter by the Grey herself. I wanted her back. So I took the train to Stirling and I got off at Silvery. It doesn't look like a normal train station, so don't worry. You're unlikely to get off there by accident unless you're really not paying attention. I mean, it makes an effort. There's a gray concrete platform, A little red brick station house with neat wooden rain shelters painted navy blue, a big sign in the same shade of blue that announces its name in the right sort of font. But it's deserted even in rush hour. The trees behind the platform are too tall and thick to see what's beyond them, and there's cats everywhere. And, well, it's too nice. Even in Scotland, public funding doesn't cover lampposts encrusted with emeralds, a wrought iron fence shaped like interlinked flowers, and a little fountain. Anyway, I got off and waited until the train disappeared beyond the horizon. Then I knelt by the fountain and thoroughly scrubbed my hands, my face, and, removing my shoes, my feet. My exit from the station was barred by a smiling young man with the most fabulously shiny hair. Why, hello there. It's a lovely day to meet someone of such a fine sort. May I just check if you're sure you intend to enter here? If you're lost, I'd be more than happy to help you home. And it is a fantastic day to be greeted so kindly by such a proper young gentleman. I do so very appreciate your offer of help, but please don't worry about me at all. I have an invitation here." The Fae nodded his head perfectly politely and stepped elegantly aside to let me pass. In the trees, the station was swallowed up behind me very quickly. It didn't take more than a few minutes' walk before I started seeing signs of other inhabitants. All of them were lovely. The perfect, graceful deer who bounded and leaped over the shining green ferns. The sweet little multicolored lanterns hung in the trees to mark the path. The flute music echoing from somewhere above me. The children who played in a clearing with their pet dogs and pet human, bright-eyed and golden-haired. I paused to watch as a sweet little Fae girl pet the human's hair, ripped his arm off cleanly and threw it clear across the clearing, calling, "Fetch!" I blinked for a moment as my mind processed that, but no, of course that was lovely. They were only playing. So lovely, like the lovely dancers twirling on a huge oak branch above me, and the lovely flowers growing on the path, and the lovely laughter of the children as they watched the human stumble in tears after his limbs. Everything in the Seelie court is polite and lovely and sweet. The meadow I was looking for showed itself to me after I'd been wandering perhaps half an hour. A crowd was gathered around a string quartet, playing music in a key I couldn't identify. I've never been able to identify it, no matter how many times I've been back, and I eventually figured it out. No matter what notes they play, what sharps or flats, what sevenths and fourths, what chords of 13 notes at once, everything simply sounds lovely. My dancing partner wasn't there, so I couldn't dance. I can never dance well without her, and to dance badly would risk being rude. I waited on the edge of the field and watched the most perfect ass I'd ever seen shown off in the most wonderful ballet outfit. What? I'm human. Deal. There was a rustling behind me in the leaves. I turned and instinctively knelt. "Ah, it's the little sea-eyed one from Edinburgh," cooed a friendly voice. A finger lifted my chin and I was staring up at emerald skin, a perfect strong jaw, mossy hair longer than I could follow, kind eyes and velvet lips. "Did you bring gifts?" Mutely, I reached into my pocket and offered up a little silver necklace I picked up at the charity shop. It didn't matter that it was cheap, it was old. "Oh, lovely. Why don't you stand?" I hesitated. Sometimes this is a trap, simply because I wouldn't want to give any insult. A laugh. "Rise, I give my permission. I know what you're here for. I don't think you want it, though." Getting to my feet was easy. I sprung up full of energy and joy. "I just need to know where she is. I don't think she did anything wrong. I want her to be safe. I'm willing to pay." The meadow seemed to get a little darker. I noticed a few people looking at me with strained smiles far too wide. "But of course," I hurriedly added, "only if that wouldn't be any trouble. I'd hate to bother you with my petty human affairs." Those eyes studied me for a long time before the Fae concluded, "You're very lucky she likes you." My smile and thanks came easy. I was lucky. The fairy led me into the woods underneath the trees. They enveloped me again within moments, and only moments later I realized I was being taken out of the Seelie court. The darkness flowed thick as oil between the flimsy branches, and the path was slick with rotting fallen leaves. We walked into a tunnel formed by an arch of holly over our heads. No brambles and blackberries. Wait, was that woven roots? Before long, it was stone. I looked up, overwhelmed, and saw a vast opening in the sky, a sheer cliff of blinding brightness. Its neat edges stood in stark contrast to the crumbling mud walls. I was confronted by a slender, whip-like, serpentine humanoid with coiling blades for limbs and staring yellow eyes. It was a creature I now know to call an edgeling. It leaned deeply into me, almost touching my neck as it sniffed around my shoulder. "Ah, yes," it sniffed. "Ah, yes." I looked behind me. My fairy guide had melted back into the woods. The edgeling's long, thread-like tongue touched my shoulder, and I startled backwards into the wall. "I just want Bryony," I told the edgeling. It snickered, spat, and turned away from me. "Heh. Are you sure?" I drew myself up to my full height, straightened my shoulders, and thought of the look of fear in my dancing partner's eyes. I remembered the minor demon I had fought off the week before, thought of Bryony's mother's grief, and stiffened my spine. "I'm the guardian of Old Edinburgh, and I'm speaking to you on behalf of humans. You can't just take little children." "Yes, I want her back, or my friends will hear about it," I snapped as I stared him down. I woke up back in my bed. That wasn't too strange. Sometimes leaving Silvery is a little strange. I've ended up in far worse places. I figured it was a good sign. I'd been listened to, respected. So I went about my day. I was cleaning the kitchen when I got a knock at my door. I went to answer it, but there was nobody there. Just you. A long, thin strip of meat curled up on my doorstep. Some kind of offering from some variety of murdery ghost cat. I had no real idea the limits of what I might be dealing with back then. I decided to leave it where it was for now until I figured out what to do and shut the door. No sooner had I shut it than there was another knock. Confused, I swung around and opened the door again. Nothing stared me in the face. I looked down and there was another long, thin strip of bloody meat. I ignored them when they knocked the third time. Just kept on cleaning my windows and doing my dishes. After I got started on cleaning my carpet, the knocking got insistent. I went to look again, this time just through my keyhole. The pile of meat had grown alarmingly, but nothing seemed dangerous, so I opened the door. The curled up pieces had been straightened out. The puddle of blood was growing, but not alarmingly. This wasn't fresh meat. But something near the end looked like a foot, almost, a shredded one. Sickened, I closed the door, put noise-canceling headphones on, and did a day's worth of spreadsheets on my laptop. I almost managed to forget about the knocking until I realized I had no milk and would need to stop out if I wanted a cup of tea. When I opened my door again, I threw up. They'd reassembled Bryony on my doorstep like a jigsaw, each slice the width of a human-height steak. The moist pieces slid apart from one another, so despite her skin being perfectly preserved, I could see in the gaps into her brain, her lungs, the neatly cracked bones of her thighs. I realized rather swiftly that I should get this inside. The police don't necessarily need to know about the supernatural, and I didn't fancy explaining the corpse to them. I managed to get the stuff, I just refused to think of it as the actual corpse of some poor kid, onto a plastic sheet in my kitchen, though a few pieces slid out and unthreaded themselves from the mess, slapping softly onto my carpet. Why the fuck did I have a white carpet? Why was that a thought on my mind anyway? I felt awful. I felt responsible. My mind decided to start counting the specks in the glass of my kitchen window, rather than feel those things. One more knock. Almost so soft I didn't hear it. I wasn't sure if it was real, but I went to the door. I just felt compelled to. Outside, it was a slice through a person, just a tattered diagonal slash. Half a pupil, half an eyelash, a centimeter of twitching lip, a few hairs that sprouted from the top and hung down to cover the exposed brain matter. A fascinating slice of chest with a tiny bit of heart tissue expanding in and out behind the skin, pumping blood that leaked down its skin to nowhere. A single toe. She was alive. She hopped towards me, but then it was too much to keep her balance. She seemed to find it easier to slither. I reached out my arm and she curled around it, lifting that single eye like a snake so she could look into mine. "I'm so sorry," I told her. I broke down, sobbing. "I'm so sorry. I have no idea. I'm just sorry. I'm so sorry." I think she caught sight of the pile in my kitchen because she stiffened on my arm. I quickly moved through into my lounge. After sitting with her and simply weeping for what felt like forever, I realized I should ask her, "Does it hurt?" The eye stared into mine. A single teardrop fell. I learned my lesson, gentle reader. I knew I had to let her go, so I broke her neck. Judge me if you want to. Fuck, you can hate me for it if you want to. Just don't step on the cracks.